while eating far more carbohydrate, processed sugar. They saw that their blood glucose during an oral glucose tolerance test was better than the basal diet, and that they required less insulin. The insulin levels were lower on a sugar water diet. And we see all this confusion about people thinking, oh, carbohydrate-rich foods, they raise your insulin, they're going to make you fat. This is not what the research shows. And again, her insulin levels dropped. You're hearing over and over and over again, oh, you eat these high carbohydrate foods, your insulin's going to go up. Maybe your blood glucose will be okay, but your pancreas is going to pump out so much insulin. That's what's going to keep your blood glucose okay. And your pancreas is going to get exhausted. That is not the case. Over and over and over again, study after study, almost 100 years of evidence-based research, insulin levels drop when you follow a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here and share some information that's really personal to me. It's affected my life, and I'm really happy to be able to share it with other people, so hopefully you can experience similar results to what I have experienced. So today, we're going to talk about insulin sensitivity, and we're going to cover, in the end, a very clear conclusion, what foods you can eat to reverse insulin resistance and reverse type 2 diabetes. So before we get into the presentation, I'd like to understand the audience a little bit. Please raise your hand if you know anybody living with diabetes. This could be a coworker, this could be a family member, it could be you. Okay, look at that. Pretty much almost every hand is up. So I'm talking to the right crowd, you're in the right room. So in the world of diabetes health, there is a lot of confusion. If you presented anybody living with diabetes these foods, whether it was in a meal, a snack, you say, hey, here's a banana, here's some sweet potatoes, here's some brown rice, they would say one of two things. Number one, I can only eat a very small amount. I'm living with diabetes, I can't eat very much of that. The other thing they might say is, I can't eat any of these foods. Are you kidding me? Those are high in carbs, and I am going to see my blood glucose spike like crazy if I eat those. I avoid them. That's what you'll hear. So these are the foods where there's confusion. When it comes to greens, non-starchy vegetables, herbs, and spices, there's pretty much agreement. Everybody knows those foods are good, they're nutrient dense, they're full of fiber, they're great. But these foods, there's a lot of confusion. In today's presentation, we're going to cover all about why eating more of these is actually going to improve your diabetes health. The more you eat, the better. And this is backed by almost 100 years of evidence-based research. And I know this information might sound crazy. It's so counterintuitive to what you've been told, but I want you to keep an open mind, and we're going to go through a lot of studies, so just pay attention to each study and take it in at the end in a sum total of what the research is showing. When I was in 7th grade, I had an English teacher who would read the last chapter of a book and then go to the beginning and finish the book. So that's what I'm going to do right here. I'm going to tell you the conclusion, okay? Living with diabetes, it is ideal to eat a minimum of 70% of calories coming from carbohydrate, a maximum of 15% of calories coming from protein, and that key number in red is a maximum of 15% of calories coming from fat. This is total fat. And I know that's the exact opposite of what is being taught in the world of diabetes nutrition in the mainstream, and I'm going to show you why and how this is backed, again, by almost 100 years of evidence-based research. So we're going to cover my story today. We're going to talk about what is insulin resistance, and we're going to go through the history. It's basically going to be a literature review. That's what we're doing today. I've had so many people just come up to me and be like, you're just making stuff up, this is not true, like there's no way, that's impossible. We get these comments on Instagram, on Facebook, and it's just like, you know what, it's time to really just go through the key studies. I'm going to go through a lot, but it's still just going to be a sliver of the research. And we're going to talk about how this can be applied, how you can use this research in your life, what foods to eat. We're going to go into that in detail. So I'm going to go through my story really quickly, again, because we're going to be covering a lot of research tonight. So I've been living with type 1 diabetes for over 19 years now. I was diagnosed when I was 12, just about to turn 13. And at that time, I was following the standard American diet. And I had many of the standard American health problems. So I would take allergy medication year-round and still get sick every year. I had chronic acne. I tried everything. Pills, microdermabrasion treatments, laser scans, everything, and didn't get the results. Didn't see my acne improve. Ended up using Accutane. It's one of the most serious drugs you can possibly use for acne. My parents had to sign a waiver because people had committed suicide after taking that drug, so it was really a last-ditch effort. And I also wore these big blue boots at night because I had plantar fasciitis. So as a competitive tennis player, this was really frustrating. I had warts on my feet, all kinds of health problems from the standard American diet. Now, as a person living with diabetes, I started to learn, okay, how can I take better care of myself? What can I do? Of course, I come across a low carbohydrate diet in the beginning. I tried the Weston A. Price Foundation. Some of you may have heard of that. I was eating a lot of grass-fed beef, raw milk. So at that time, I remember I would go to the farmer's market. I would buy milk that was for a cat because you couldn't sell raw milk to humans. So I was doing that at that time. And I eventually switched away from doing that diet because I didn't see any significant changes in my diabetes health. My insulin sensitivity didn't improve, my blood glucose management didn't improve. So I kept on reading, watching documentaries, learning more, and I came across a Gabriel Cousens diet. So this was a ketogenic, plant-based diet where I was mainly eating greens, things like celery, non-starchy vegetables, lots of oil, and lots of nuts and seeds. That was the Gabriel Cousens diet. And the big problem on that one is I just had no energy. So at this point, I'm a freshman in college at the University of Florida. I was very confused, very frustrated after all the effort I had put in and just feeling terrible. All my friends are going to the cafeteria, eating all this garbage food, they're fine, and I'm putting all this effort into eating this way and not feeling good. So I went back to a naturopath that I had seen previously, and she suggested maybe you should do chelation therapy. And I was like, okay, well, maybe that's a problem. So maybe I have heavy metals, and if I can get rid of those, I might feel better. So this would require me to drive from Gainesville, Florida to Tampa. It was going to be very expensive, but I was ready to do it. I was committed. And before I made that commitment, I heard a podcast. And this podcast changed my life. It was Doug Graham talking about how a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet can also get rid of heavy metals. He's talking all about fruit, all about eating lots and lots of fruit. And I was like, wow, I've been avoiding fruit for all this time. And he's saying this is going to help me. I'm like, I got to try this. Let me give it a try. So I signed up for his coaching program, and it absolutely changed my life. I started eating lots of fruits and vegetables. I increased my carbohydrate intake by over 20 times. I had energy again. I was loving the variety of foods. There's a picture of me picking persimmons there. I was really getting in touch with my food, where it was coming from, and getting really excited about this new lifestyle. So that was in December of 2006. So the big change that happened here was my change in insulin sensitivity. When I was doing the Gabriel Cousens diet, again, doing it perfectly just as taught, I would consume 30 grams of carbohydrate per day and take about 10 units of insulin. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. 24-hour insulin sensitivity is calculated by taking your total carbohydrate consumption and dividing that by the total insulin used per day. So people living with insulin-dependent diabetes, it's very easy for us to see changes in insulin sensitivity. Very easy. Nowadays, for over 12 years, I've been eating a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, eating 750 grams of carbohydrate per day, and taking 34 units of insulin. That's a physiological, normal amount of insulin that my pancreas would produce if it wasn't damaged. So that's the goal for people living with any form of insulin-dependent diabetes. We just want to inject the insulin that would have normally been produced. So between 30 and 50 units of insulin, that's about what a normal, healthy pancreas will secrete. I'm using 34 and eating far more carbohydrate than most people. Therefore, you can see a huge change in insulin sensitivity. That's what we're going to talk about today. So it's 12 years later now. I feel amazing. My current A1C is 5.3% in the non-diabetic range, consistently active, very predictable blood glucose because my diet is consistent. I don't take any other pharmaceutical medications other than insulin, and my skin has cleared up dramatically without any other drugs or treatments. So before we get into the literature review, I just want to cover some of the terminology here. I like to break up diabetes into two different types. You have insulin-dependent and non-insulin dependent. So I'm in the insulin-dependent category with type 1 diabetes. We don't know what causes type 1 diabetes. We don't know exactly how it happens. We don't know how to reverse it. But what we know is that the pancreas is damaged and doesn't produce sufficient quantities of insulin. Therefore, I need to inject exogenous insulin. This also happens in people living with type 1.5 diabetes. So type 1.5 diabetes is essentially a slow onset version of type 1. Again, we don't know the cause, we don't know how to reverse it, but what we see is that people's pancreas has been damaged, it's not producing enough insulin, and therefore they usually eventually need to inject small amounts of exogenous insulin to compensate for what they're not producing. Now, another thing I don't think is talked about enough is that you could be living with insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. And this is when you've been following an unhealthy lifestyle for too long and your pancreas is exhausted. And this, we can measure a C-peptide test and we can know for sure your pancreas is not producing sufficient quantities of insulin, but you don't have any antibodies. So type 1 and type 1.5 diabetes, there are antibodies present, and we know that that is an autoimmune version of diabetes, whereas type 2, insulin-dependent type 2, means your pancreas is just exhausted. And this is important to set expectations, because some people, you're going to hear about what I'm talking about today, they try the program and they don't see results immediately, and we see this over and over and over again. It's because they're simply not producing enough insulin. Now, in the non-insulin dependent category, we have prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. This is about 95% of all people living with diabetes. Okay, this is a situation where you're producing plenty of insulin, your body's just not using it properly. Here's the key point. Insulin resistance can be present in all forms. So as we saw in my case, as a person living with type 1, when I was following that ketogenic plant-based diet, I was insulin resistant. My insulin sensitivity was terrible. If I tried to eat any carbohydrate-rich food, my blood glucose would spike. But I can also become insulin sensitive. So you saw that on that slide as well. So it can be present in all forms. You cannot develop prediabetes or type 2 diabetes unless you are insulin resistant. It's a prerequisite for developing those conditions. Insulin resistance is the cause of prediabetes and the cause of type 2 diabetes. All right? Why is insulin sensitivity important? Why does this matter? So when I was at that 3-to-1 24-hour insulin sensitivity ratio, let's just say I solved my energy problem and I felt good again. Why would it matter that I was insulin resistant? The reason it matters is because if you are insulin resistant, you increase your chances of developing all the conditions you see on the screen here. Heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, blindness, retinopathy, PCOS. It's a long list. This isn't even all of them. This is a short summary. And I have heart disease in red because that is the #1 killer of all people living with diabetes. We do not die of high blood glucose readings. We don't die of a high A1C. We die of the complications of diabetes, primarily heart disease. So even if your blood glucose numbers are good and you're insulin resistant, you're increasing your chance of dying from the #1 condition that kills people living with diabetes. All right, so trust me when I say it's important to be insulin sensitive. This is something that is important to measure. So what is insulin resistance? Here's the definition. The diminished ability of cells to respond to the action of insulin in transporting glucose from the bloodstream into muscle and other tissues. Basically what that's saying is insulin resistance is when your body is struggling to take glucose out of your bloodstream into your cells. Therefore, you have excess glucose in your bloodstream, you have high blood glucose, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes. That is insulin resistance. So what is the cause of this problem? Fat blocks insulin from working properly. The primary cause of insulin resistance is consuming a diet where you consume too much fat. This fat gets stored in your muscle and liver cells, and it causes insulin resistance because when you have fat stored in cells that are not designed to store fat, the ability of insulin to open the door and let glucose in gets diminished. So in today's presentation, we're not going to go into the nutritional biochemistry of this. My co-founder of Mastering Diabetes, Cyrus Kambata, has done that many times. Like Aaron said, 2 years ago, almost from this day, gave a presentation in this room. Now on YouTube has over 1 million views. I highly suggest you check it out to get the nutritional biochemistry aspect of this. Just Google insulin resistance diet and you will find that video. Today we're going to go over literature showing what happens in humans who are fed either high-fat foods or low-fat foods, research dating back to the early 1920s. So here we go. Now into the fun part. In 1926, Dr. Sansom published an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, in 1922, that's when insulin was discovered. Prior to that, diabetes was pretty much a death sentence. The quality of life was terrible. They fed them a very, very low carbohydrate diet, low calorie. They had no energy. They didn't think clearly. It was not a good situation. Once they discovered insulin, doctors could start doing some more experimenting and having a little bit of fun. So in 1926, Dr. Sansom does what he called in his own study a radical experiment. 150 patients, he started increasing their carbohydrate consumption. He gave them white bread, potatoes, low-fat milk, and fruit. This is still a high-fat diet, okay? This is the early days. 43% of calories coming from fat. Here's what he saw. His patients did not require more insulin. He thought for sure, if I add these carbohydrate-rich foods, they're going to need more insulin, but maybe they'll feel better. And he was mind blown to see that no, I added more carbohydrate and they didn't need more insulin. This is the beginning of doctors starting to understand insulin sensitivity. But more importantly than just the insulin sensitivity, they could return to their normal physical activity. Their mental activity was back to normal. They did not have difficulty managing their blood glucose. Again, he didn't expect that. They had improved cardiovascular health. They found the diet was more palatable. What they were feeding diabetics prior to the discovery of insulin was just awful. It was really hard for people to even eat that way. They had reduced cravings, and the diet was cheaper. In 1927, Dr. Sweeney did a fascinating study with 23 male medical students. He fed them 4 different diets for 2 days. The first diet was a protein diet, lean meat and egg whites. The fat diet included oil, mayonnaise, cream, and butter. Then for 2 days, they put on a water diet. They're basically fasting for 2 days. And then the 4th diet was a carbohydrate diet. And I am not exaggerating when you see these pictures on the screen. This is exactly what he fed his students. Sugar, candy, pastries, bread, potatoes, syrup, fruit, brown rice, and oats. Okay? That is what he fed the carbohydrate. These are the results of an oral glucose tolerance test, seeing what would happen when these 4 diets were tested, what would happen to the insulin sensitivity of the patients. As you can see, the carbohydrate diet showed non-diabetic. That showed the greatest amount of insulin sensitivity. They had a blood glucose average of 96 at 2 hours after the end of the oral glucose tolerance test. The high-fat diet, the average was 173. In 2 days, healthy young male medical students were turned into diabetics by feeding them a high-fat diet. This is in 1927. So he thought, hey, maybe it was the person. Maybe it wasn't the diet, it was the person themselves. They were insulin resistant. So he tried the same thing. He gave the same student both diets. So on the bottom, you see a dotted line. On the top, you see a dotted line. That's the same person eating the different diet. On the fat diet, oral glucose tolerance test showed that they tested as a diabetic. On the carbohydrate diet, non-diabetic, less than 100. The same thing with the solid line. In 1930, Dr. Rabinowitz started experimenting with high carbohydrate, low fat diets, lower fat diets in his patients. So he got some great results, and we're going to look at 3 studies from him. He was very methodical. I think part of his success was his ability to teach the diet to his patients. He would use these wooden blocks, which would help them understand the portion size, and that's a big deal when it comes to helping people limit the amount of butter and stuff like that they're eating. So this was the general diet plan that he devised. For breakfast, they were allowed 1 egg, they were allowed fruit, and then they could have a small amount of butter. It was about 10 grams, then 3 pieces of bread, and 4 ounces of low-fat milk, a half a glass of milk. Lunch, they could have some broth, they could have a very small amount of animal protein, literally 1.5 ounces, 45 grams of animal protein. They could have some vegetables, some fruit, and then again, the same butter, bread, and milk. And then dinner was very similar. Again, no more than 1.5 ounces of animal protein. Then there was vegetables, fruit. And if you look at just the bread, so there's 9 pieces of bread here, 18 grams of carbohydrate each. That's 162 grams of carbohydrate just from bread. And again, this is a lot in the 1930s based on where people were coming from with diabetes treatment. He made it very clear that bacon, fatty meats, fish, and cream were forbidden, not to be eaten at all. And his diet ended up being about an average of 24% of calories coming from fat. So in his first study in 1930, he was really just encouraging his colleagues to try this out. He's like, I'm seeing great results. This was in 50 patients. He saw that his insulin-dependent patients needed less insulin and less injections, eating more carbohydrate, needing less insulin. In the patients who were non-insulin dependent, he thought that, you know what, they're probably going to need insulin. Maybe they'll feel better, they'll get a better quality of life, but they'll probably need more insulin. It did not happen. They did not need insulin on the high carbohydrate diet. They were satisfied. They saw cholesterol levels go down, blood glucose improved, and it was also a practically isocaloric value. So meaning that this was not accomplished by people eating very small amounts of food. It wasn't calorie restriction. It wasn't a limited amount of food. It was pretty solid, similar to what they were eating previously. In 1932, he published a paper reporting his results with 500 patients. He reported a 97% success rate. That means 16 people were not successful out of the 500. 13 of them, he reported, did not follow the diet. And the other 3, they didn't get better on either a low carbohydrate diet or a high carbohydrate diet. So they were just really challenging patients. 97% success rate. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with his ability to teach the diet and get people to actually do it. So on the screen here, you'll see he has a quote from the paper. Diabetes does not appear to be due to defective production of insulin, but to interference with the action of a normal supply. So in 1932, Dr. Rabinowitz is already seeing that it's not insulin production that's the problem in these cases. It's the fact that they're eating diets that is inhibiting insulin's ability to function properly. In 1935, he published a paper where he looked at, there was 100 patients, 50 of them were treated with the old diet for 5 years, and 50 of them were treated with the new diet for 5 years. And he looked at the results, and you could see that the average insulin use on the old diet, 60% of calories from fat, was 32.2 units, and it only went down to 31.8. It's a 1% reduction. Okay? On the new diet, 24% of calories from fat, the insulin reduction went from 24.6 to 10.6, a 57% reduction in insulin use while eating more carbohydrate-rich foods. And they also saw that 12 of the patients did not need to use insulin at all. They could stop using insulin completely. That's an incidence of 24% of the patients could stop using insulin, eating more carbohydrate-rich foods. He also said that his patients feel and look well. They adhere to the diet. It's not a struggle because they get to eat carbohydrate-rich foods, which people crave. He said that diet is applicable to all forms of diabetes. He also noted that there was a decrease in the incidence of comas. Cardiovascular health improved. He found it was very simple for his patients to follow this diet. And he also found that his patients had a low tuberculosis rate compared to other practices. He concluded the study with this. Suffice it to say that it now appears to be fairly well established that carbohydrates improve, whereas fats impair carbohydrate tolerance, and that carbohydrates increase, whereas fats decrease the sensitivity of the individual, animal and man, to insulin. It's in 1935, Dr. Rabinowitz explaining insulin sensitivity. At the same time, Dr. Himsworth in London was conducting some fascinating studies. You can see here, this is a high carbohydrate diet on the bottom, and you'll see a high fat diet on the top. This is an oral glucose tolerance test. On the high fat diet, they went as high as 200. On the high carbohydrate diet, the blood glucose never went above 120. So in this paper, he concludes, whilst on the high carbohydrate diet, the glucose tolerance was raised. In 1935, Dr. Himsworth published a landmark study. What you see on the screen are results of an insulin sensitivity test in one patient who was fed 7 different diets, 80% of calories from fat, all the way down to 13% of calories from fat. And when you see, what you want to look at is the triangle in the upper right corner. The larger the triangle, the more insulin sensitive that person is. So as you can see, it was a proportional change. As he lowered the fat, insulin sensitivity improves. So let me blow this up a little bit. When you could see what he did is he injected 3 units of insulin and saw how long did it take for the insulin to work and how low would it drive the blood glucose. In the left, 80% diet took 7 minutes for the insulin to start doing anything and only drove the blood glucose down to about 85. On the right, on the low-fat diet, 13% of calories coming from fat, insulin worked in 2 minutes and drove the blood glucose below 70. Insulin sensitivity being displayed right here. In 1939, it gets a little crazy, guys. In 1939, Walter Kempner created the rice fruit diet. So he was treating kidney disease. And at that time, doctors did not know how to help kidney disease patients. They were essentially a lost cause. So he's got some tough patients. And he devises a diet feeding them white rice, white sugar, fruit, and fruit juice. This is the composition of the diet. 94% of calories coming from carbohydrate, a lot of that refined carbohydrate. You only have 2% of calories coming from fat on this diet. And this is what he saw. He reversed all the conditions you see on the screen. Kidney disease, obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, arthritis, heart disease, heart failure, psoriasis, retinopathy, all reversed on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate, processed diet. Now, what would happen when he feeds this diet to people living with diabetes? Even he was skeptical. He wasn't sure how this was going to work out. So in 1958, he publishes a paper on 100 consecutive diabetes patients. There was no cherry picking here. These are the results from 100 consecutive patients. Here's what he saw. On average, blood glucose levels decreased. Insulin requirements decreased. Cholesterol went down. And the people who had high cholesterol, 85% of patients saw that drop. He saw improvements in cardiovascular disease and kidney disease improve significantly. This is the exact opposite of what you would expect. This should have resulted in a metabolic disaster. It did not. They became more insulin sensitive. Their diabetes health improved. Their overall health improved. Dr. Kempner treated over 18,000 patients and saw great results with, again, a highly refined, low-fat diet. In 1975, Dr. Kempner published a paper of 106 patients who had all lost over a minimum of 100 pounds following the rice fruit diet. So this woman initially weighed 213 pounds. She was using 90 units of NPH insulin. Her fasting blood glucose was 315. Her blood glucose before lunch was 350, and before dinner, 408. After 8 months on the rice fruit diet, she weighed 98 pounds. She was using 0 units of insulin. Her fasting blood glucose was 100. Her blood glucose before lunch was 75, and before dinner it was 80. In 1955, Dr. Inder Singh published an article in the Lancet. He had 80 patients in this study. 20 to 120 units of insulin were being used, so all the patients were using insulin, and the diet he fed them was 13% of calories from fat. Here's what he saw after 18 weeks. 80% stopped insulin completely. 6 patients that were using 80 to 120 units of insulin dropped down to 20 to 40. 6 patients required less than 10 units of insulin per day. Incredible change in insulin sensitivity across the board on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet published in the Lancet in 1955. It gets a little crazy again. Dr. Brunzell, the New England Journal of Medicine, 1971, he has a study where he has 22 subjects. Some of them did not have diabetes. 13 of them essentially had pre-diabetes. Fed them a weight-maintaining controlled diet for 8 to 10 days. Then he fed them a weight-maintaining, low-fat diet, a processed diet, for 10 days. 0% of calories coming from fat. The only way to do that is to feed somebody a highly processed diet. All whole foods have fat. When you eat bananas, when you eat lettuce, when you eat beans, you get fat. Plenty of fat in whole plant foods. So how did he achieve a diet of 0% of calories coming from fat? He fed them straight up sugar. This is basically a sugar water solution diet with some added protein. Okay? No fat, no whole foods. This is the formula diet. What did he see in his patients? Uniformly across the board, fasting blood glucose decreased. 8% drop in the people who were not living with diabetes. In the 30 patients who did have diabetes, a 9.6% drop in their fasting blood glucose. It's a sugar water diet, very processed, okay? Again, this is insulin sensitivity in action. So in this same study, in 12 of the patients, he did a oral glucose tolerance test and also tested their insulin levels. It was a paired test. So while eating far more carbohydrate, processed sugar, they saw that their blood glucose during an oral glucose tolerance test was better than the basal diet, and that they required less insulin. The insulin levels were lower on a sugar water diet. And we see all this confusion about people thinking, oh, carbohydrate-rich foods, they raise your insulin, they're going to make you fat. This is not what the research shows. So he concluded the study. How then is the paradox of improved glucose tolerance with unchanged insulin response explained? These data suggest that the high carbohydrate diet increased the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. It's 1971 in the New England Journal of Medicine. In 1976, Dr. Keim published a great study. He had 13 patients, and in this diet, he was comparing the American Diabetes Association diet to a low-fat diet, 9% of calories coming from fat, and here were the results. After just 14 days on the low-fat diet, those who were using oral diabetes medications, there were 5. While following the ADA diet, they needed their oral diabetes medications. When they started following the low-fat diet, in 14 days, they did not require those medications anymore to maintain a healthy blood glucose. The people who were using 15 to 20 units of insulin on the ADA diet, there were 5. On the low-fat diet, there was only 1, and the one person who was still requiring insulin saw that it dropped from 24 units to 15 units. More carbohydrate, less insulin. That's an example of improved insulin sensitivity right there. There were 3 patients where the insulin requirements did not change. But again, it's important to note here, their carbohydrate intake almost doubled, and they're using the same amount of insulin. We are repeatedly seeing insulin sensitivity. And this is an important point here because we see this a lot in our coaching practice. So we've had over 3,500 people run through our coaching practice, and they have been misdiagnosed in a lot of cases. And so I can speculate that these 3 people had impaired insulin production. They probably were not producing enough of their own insulin. They will likely need insulin for the long term, whereas the other people were likely producing excess or more than enough insulin, and that's why when they changed their diet, they could get off and reduce their medication significantly. So again, we'd have to get into the details here with these people, but seeing that even though their insulin requirements stayed the same, the fact that their insulin sensitivity improved is decreasing their chances of all those conditions we saw in the beginning, heart disease, kidney disease, fatty liver, all that stuff. They're going to have better health, and they may have just simply required insulin. And we can get into detail with that today in our coaching program, which is really fun. In this study, they also saw significant reduction in triglycerides and cholesterol. So there's a lot of skepticism around people saying, hey, you improved your insulin sensitivity simply because you lost weight. So you got both camps saying this about each other. The low carbohydrate camp says, look, you guys see improvements in insulin sensitivity because they lost weight. We say the same thing about them. And so Dr. Anderson from University of Kentucky in 1979 set out to answer this specific question. What would happen if I fed patients a high carbohydrate diet but did not allow them to lose any weight? So he had 20 lean men, all of them living with diabetes, high fasting blood glucose readings. He fed them a weight-maintaining control diet for an average of 7 days. And then he fed them a weight-maintaining low-fat diet for 16 days. This is 9% of calories coming from fat. In 16 days, he saw, hopefully, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but in 16 days, we saw a lot of people who were starting out with about 15 units of insulin going down to 0. So again, just 16 days. It's a very short period of time. 10 of the 20 people, half of them, stopped using insulin completely. No weight loss, high carbohydrate diet. That is a dramatic improvement in insulin sensitivity. That's what we're seeing right there. Everyone reduced their insulin requirements. And the reason there's a 12 on the screen there is because beyond the 16 days, there were 2 more people who did not require any insulin. Everybody reduced insulin requirements. Fasting and post-meal blood glucose levels lowered. Again, less medication, more carbohydrate, lower blood glucose readings. 29% drop in cholesterol levels. That was a landmark study from James W. Anderson. This is one of my favorite studies to talk about. Dr. Shintani saw that Native Hawaiians were not following the Native Hawaiian diet, and they're developing many chronic diseases. Obesity is a big problem, still is to this day. So he devised a study where he had 19 patients, all were obese, and he fed them an ad libitum plant-based diet for 21 days. Now, they would go to a center for 21 days in a row. They would show up in the morning, they would be fed breakfast, they did some biomarkers, tested them, they gave them lunch, they gave them a snack, and then they could go out and live their day, and then they would come back for dinner and an education session. They were always told that they could eat as much as they want. They were never limited in their plant-based foods that they could eat. And these are the kind of foods they were eating. He devised, again, this is try to do a native Hawaiian style diet. So taro is a food that's eaten in Hawaii, and poi is that second picture there. That's basically taro just mashed up. Then you have sweet potatoes, yams, plenty of fruit, and there's plenty of vegetables, greens. It was a really clean plant-based diet. The only foods that were limited were animal products. So they could have 5 to 7 ounces of chicken or fish per day. This is what happened in 21 days. Average weight loss was 17 pounds. Blood pressure dropped, cholesterol dropped, and they saw a decrease in fasting blood glucose. Now he talks about this in detail in the study, but this is hard to interpret because they were on medications, and medications were reduced right away. So if these patients were forced to eat their regular diet but not take any medication before the study started, they would come in with a much higher blood glucose reading, 200s, 300s. And then they would see this drop down to 123, you'd see a bigger difference. So in this study, the patients who were living with diabetes saw a 55-point drop in their fasting blood glucose. Several of the people were not living with diabetes, they didn't come in with a huge elevation. That's why you don't see some dramatic drop here. But the point is, 21 days, eat as much as you want of carbohydrate-rich foods. They take less medication and see an improvement in blood glucose readings. A huge takeaway from this study is a really quick highlight here on calorie density. So before the study started, they evaluated what foods were they eating, and they could figure out the total volume by weight of the foods that they were eating. And they were eating 3.8 pounds per day of edible food and consuming 2,600 calories. When they got to eat as much as they wanted of high carbohydrate, plant-based foods, they got to eat more food, 4.1 pounds per day, and ate 1,000 less calories. And they used validated surveys to test their satiety levels. And you can see at the bottom there, the patients measured to medium or high satiety. They were not hungry, they were not starving, they were always encouraged to eat as much as they wanted, and they got to feel full and lose weight. It's a big aspect of the program that we teach. In 1994, James Barnard published an article in Diabetes Care. This was a review of 652 patients that attended the Pritikin Longevity Center. So the Pritikin Center is actually, now it's in Florida. It's still alive and well. You can go there anytime. It's a great place. But at the time, it was in Santa Monica, which is right down the street from where I live. I always find that interesting. You can see it's now a very nice hotel. But that's where these patients did their 26-day program with Dr. Pritikin. It was a low-fat diet, less than 10% of calories from fat. Again, mostly starch-based, plenty of breads, plenty of beans, peas, plenty of vegetables, a little bit of animal products, and a little bit of low-fat dairy. And here are the results. In 26 days, looking at 652 patients, 71% stopped using oral diabetes medications. 39% stopped using insulin, 34% stopped using blood pressure medications, 33% reduction in triglycerides, 22% reduction in cholesterol. Again, more carbohydrate, less diabetes medication. We're seeing insulin sensitivity improving across the board. In 2001, Dr. Shintani repeated his study, and this time he fed people a little bit more processed food. There was some more bread, some more pasta included, but there was still taro, poi, sweet potatoes, yams, plenty of fruit, beans, a little bit of tofu in here, plenty of greens and non-starchy vegetables. But this time he could only have 8 ounces of animal products per week, so a little bit more limited on the animal products. This is a 12% of calories from fat. And again, I want to emphasize, Unlimited quantities of foods were made available except for fish and chicken. No calorie restriction, no portion constriction of the foods that people living with diabetes are told to avoid. And here are the results again. 10.8 pounds lost, blood pressure dropped, cholesterol dropped, fasting blood glucose dropped again. Same situation as last time. Medications were reduced. Many of the people were not living with diabetes, didn't even have that high blood glucose reading, so you don't see a dramatic change, but the point stands, their blood glucose levels improved. Unlimited potatoes, unlimited bananas, unlimited rice, unlimited bread. This is what happened. So in 2014, Dr. John McDougall published a paper in the Nutrition Journal, and this is where he analyzed records of 1,615 patients who've been through his 10-day residential program, and they assessed the changes that happened after 7 days, another ad libitum, low-fat, plant-based diet. They could eat as much as they wanted. It was less than 10% of calories from fat. Now, Dr. John McDougall is famous for emphasizing starch. It's a starch-based diet, even if it's a little bit processed. He's cool with it. So pancakes at breakfast, go for it. Lots of pasta, plenty of bread, sweet potatoes, yams, rice, beans, peas, lentils. And he, again, focus on the starch. That is the hallmark of Dr. McDougall's approach and his success. And things like salad, vegetables, fruit, he just literally says, just on the side. Those are just side things. Eat starch. Eat as much as you want. Be satisfied. All his meals are buffets, and you get to eat as much as you want. So in 7 days, just 7 days, statistically significant decreases in cholesterol, weight, blood pressure, and also creatine and blood urea nitrogen. So what happened to the diabetes health? Now again, just like Dr. Shintani's work, Dr. McDougall is very aggressive about taking people off medications. They check in on day 1. Even if they're using insulin, he takes it off. He says, you know what, I'm just going to feed you this high carbohydrate diet and let's see what happens over the course of a few days. Maybe I'll add medications back in. So 91% reduced or stopped diabetes medications in 7 days. And they still saw a drop in their fasting blood glucose. In 2017, Dr. Wright published a study called the Broad Study in Nutrition and Diabetes, which is a subjournal of Nature. This is another randomized, controlled trial. 65 patients, in order to be included in the study, they had to have one of the following. They had to be obese, overweight, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol. The intervention group was given an ad libitum plant-based diet. So in this case, they were not at a residential center. They did not show up at a facility that provided them with the food. They were given education. They were taught how to eat this way. So that's why you see there's that range, 7 to 15% of calories coming from fat. And the foods, again, ad libitum, whole grains, beans, peas, lentils, potatoes, pastas, non-starchy vegetables, fruits. They were taught to eat as much of those as they wanted. After 6 months on the control diet, patients lost 6 pounds. On the low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet, they lost 26 pounds, eating as much as they wanted. In the control group, the overall medications used, all types of medications, diabetes, blood pressure, it didn't matter, increased. 8% increase in medication usage. In the low-fat diet, a 29% decrease. They started using less medications across the board. 0% reversed their diabetes. In the low-fat group, there was 29% incidence of people who tested as a non-diabetic. The A1C was in the non-diabetic range in the 6-month period that these results were taken. There was no reduction in diabetes medications in the control group. And in the low-fat group, everybody reduced their diabetes medications. More carbohydrate, less diabetes medications, better results. The A1C in the control diet increased from 5.5% to 5.7%. In the low-fat group, on average, people went from being a person living with prediabetes to no diabetes, 6% to 5.5%. He also noted that there was an increased quality of life, better self-efficacy with nutrition, higher self-esteem, no significant change in enjoyment of food or the cost of food. This is Tammy. I love sharing Tammy's story. She's a member of the Mastering Diabetes Coaching Program. Every time I think about her, I just get a big smile on my face. So we have thousands of people all around the world going through our program. And as much as I would love to meet every single one of them in person, I can't do that. But Tammy lives in Los Angeles, so I got to meet her at the Hollywood Farmers Market when she just signed up for the program. And I remember she was kicking and screaming and just not believing this was going to work. I remember buying oranges and her looking at me and saying, "Are you sure? I don't think I'm going to be able to eat oranges. This is not going to work for me." I said, "Trust me, Tammy. Just listen, follow the program. It's going to work." So after 7 months of following the program, her A1C went from 7.1% to 5.3% in the non-diabetic range. Again, that 5.3% is unmedicated. She stopped using metformin. She lost 38 pounds. And again, her insulin levels dropped. You're hearing over and over and over again, "Oh, you eat these high carbohydrate foods, your insulin's going to go up. Maybe your blood glucose will be okay, but your pancreas is going to pump out so much insulin. That's what's going to keep your blood glucose okay. And your pancreas is going to get exhausted." That is not the case. Over and over and over again, study after study, almost 100 years of evidence-based research, insulin levels drop when you follow a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. We see that in Tammy. We saw it in the research. It happens repeatedly. Her fasting blood glucose went down. Again, requiring less insulin to keep her blood glucose in a healthy range. She reversed fatty liver disease. She had debilitating pain and was not even able to go to the grocery store without being in pain. The picture on the left is her struggling. The two pictures on the right are her celebrating her accomplishment of getting to the top of a pyramid. This is Raj. Raj has a fantastic story. You can see just the transformation in his face alone. Raj decided to change his lifestyle after he heard his two sons playing basketball and joking that they could not invite dad to play with them because he was too sick. When he heard his son say that, he went to Google, did some research, ended up finding Mastering Diabetes. He actually found the very video that was recorded here 2 years ago. He said, "Okay, I'm going to try this program." And in 10 months, his A1C went from 7.4% to 5.2%, again, unmedicated. He stopped using metformin. His fasting blood glucose saw a significant drop, 180 to 85. He reversed fatty liver disease. His doctor told him that he could not reverse fatty liver disease or type 2 diabetes, and here he is today showing what is possible. His cholesterol dropped, and he lost 54 pounds. Here's a picture of him playing with his kids, looking happy and healthy. And these are pictures of his food, his mango stash right there, which I'm very proud of. He eats vibrant, healthy, carbohydrate-rich meals, and he has his life back. These are the types of meals that people eat on the Mastering Diabetes program. In the upper left there, you see some squash, some lentils, I believe. You see fruit, really colorful, vibrant, calorie-dense plant foods is what people eat on the Mastering Diabetes program. So we have put our food into a simple traffic light system. So green light foods include fruits, starchy vegetables, beans, lentils and peas, intact whole grains, leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, herbs and spices, and mushrooms. And the key point here is that green light foods are foods that you can eat ad libitum, as much as you want. Do not restrict these foods. Do not count the amount that you're eating. Eat as much as you want. And they're also listed in a specific order where the calorie-dense green light foods are at the top. Remember that first slide I showed you? There was the picture of the bananas, the brown rice, the sweet potatoes. Those are the foods you want to emphasize. And of course, legumes as well. I didn't have legumes on that slide because those people don't argue as much about those. But these foods are the ones you want to emphasize. More of these, the better. We see this in Dr. John McDougall's work. We see this in Dr. Shintani's work. We see this in, again, the processed carbohydrates that people are eating in the research. These foods lead to maximum insulin sensitivity. Leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, herbs and spices, mushrooms, very important foods as well. I personally, I don't eat a meal without one of those included. And I would recommend that people in our program also include those in every meal, but the center has got to be the calorie-dense green light foods. The yellow light category, these are foods that are either a little bit more processed or they're high in fat. So nuts and seeds, avocados, coconut meat, olives, and soy. So the whole version of soy is edamame. That's a whole food. Research has shown it is very healthy. All these foods, again, they're whole foods, they're plant-based, they're very nutritious. We're just encouraging you to eat a smaller amount. Be cognizant of how much you're eating, because as you eat too much, you can develop insulin resistance. I saw this in my own body. When I was following a plant-based ketogenic diet, I developed insulin resistance, even though these are whole, healthy foods. We saw that in Dr. Hemsworth's work, where he was showing the 7 different diets. As you increase the fat, you became a little bit more insulin resistant. And that can happen with plant foods as well. So foods like pasta alternatives, sprouted bread, dried fruit, these are a little bit more processed foods, and you just want to be cognizant of how much you're having. Again, still healthy, can still be a part of your diet in reversing insulin resistance, but they are just a little more processed. Something like fermented food, again, it's healthy, but it's high in sodium. So it's not a food that you're going to sit down and eat as much as you want of. That's the distinction between green light and yellow light. Red light foods are foods we suggest that you avoid or minimize as much as possible. So animal products are in here. Oils of any kind. This is olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, it doesn't matter. Oils are one of the most refined foods on the planet. The vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, majority of those have been stripped out. Fiber is gone. It is the most calorie-dense food on the planet. It will inhibit your weight loss. Even small amounts will cause definitely a decrease in your ability to lose weight. Now, refined sweeteners, coconut products, processed food, these are all in the red light categories. A lot of these are quite obvious, but I will just mention, these days we have a lot of processed, vegan, plant-based foods coming on the market. We put a majority of those in the red light category. There's just a lot of processed stuff in there. There's a lot of added sugars. They're high in fat. We'd recommend you don't eat them. Really focus on these whole, minimally refined foods that are in the green and yellow light category. That's how you will get optimal results. This is the story of Sana, as you can see on the screen. She saw some improvements in her skin when she transitioned to a low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet. She's a member of our coaching program, but more importantly, she reversed stage 3 kidney disease. So Sana is living with type 1 diabetes. When she joined our program, she was eating 25 grams of carbohydrate per day and taking 22 units of insulin per day. She increased her carbohydrate intake to 200 and decreased her insulin use down to 11. That is insulin sensitivity. Way more carbohydrate, less insulin, and reversed chronic disease, reversed kidney disease. So you can see her kidney disease numbers on the screen there. She also had her blood pressure come down. So now she's living a very happy, healthy life. Now you may have read in some articles or some newspapers that low carbohydrate and low fat diets have been compared in peer-reviewed journals. So this is a headline from a very popular website, and I just got to say, I like the low carbohydrate leaders and advocates. We have more in common than we don't have in common. We're all out there trying to do the same thing. We're trying to help people, and a lot of these people, they've seen amazing results themselves, and they're just trying to pass that on. Like, I get that. But there's still some major points that we see differently, and I think it's worth highlighting, so that's why I'm sharing this. So on the screen here, you don't need to read those graphs or understand them. I'm just including them to illustrate that this article was a very thorough article. These are very passionate researchers. They took a lot of time to put this together. It was quality journalism. And here's what they concluded. It is time to retire the fad. Keep in mind that all of these studies are randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of science. All are published in respected, peer-reviewed medical journals. These studies are scientific evidence, as good as it gets, that low carb is much more effective than the low-fat diet that is still being recommended all over the world. It is time to retire the low-fat fad. So when you see articles like this that are very well done, very thorough, talking about peer-reviewed evidence, I can see what's confusing. It's very confusing. Here's the problem. I looked at every single study that was mentioned in that article. Not a single one of them is a low-fat diet. Not a single one of them is 15% of calories coming from fat or less. Majority between 25% and 36%. So when you see this in the research, they are not actually using a low-fat diet, and they also are not talking about insulin sensitivity. In that one study where it was 17.8% of calories coming from fat, they got tremendous results. It was very good results in the low-fat group. So the take-home message here is, when it comes to insulin sensitivity, there is one approach that maximizes your insulin sensitivity. That is a low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet. There are 0 studies from the ketogenic, low-carbohydrate world that show insulin sensitivity improving without any weight loss. 0. We have plenty, including the Dr. Kempner study and some of those other studies where Rabinovich was talking about practically isocaloric diets. We see this over and over again. We can easily demonstrate improved insulin sensitivity without weight loss. It can easily be done. The other issue here is that the longest lived people on the planet, people who live into their 80s, 90s, 100s, who are healthy, have low chronic disease rates, they eat carbohydrate-rich foods. There are no examples to the contrary. All right? I want to share one more testimonial here. Heather, as you can see on the left, she eats carbohydrate-rich foods, plenty of them. She's got a fridge stocked up, very healthy fridge right there. She's a bodybuilder. She's eating plenty of calories, not calorie restricting, eating as much as she wants. Her A1C dropped from 9.2% to 5.2% while following the Mastering Diabetes program. She's a member of our coaching program. And in that time, again, that 5.2% A1C, unmedicated. She stopped using Zigduo and Trulicity, which are diabetes medications, and she's now living a diabetes-free life and loving it. On the screen here, you see results from her continuous glucose monitor. This is her average blood glucose over a 9-day period. So continuous glucose monitors measure blood glucose every 5 minutes. So she can see this data, what is her blood glucose throughout the day. And she is consistently between 80 and 120. She has a flatline blood glucose using 0 diabetes medications, having a non-diabetic A1C, eating unlimited carbohydrate-rich food. When it comes to the long-lived people, I have a map here showing a lot of different groups of people that have been studied and verified through lots of peer-reviewed literature, and majority of these. I just want to highlight Okinawa, Japan. Right before this lecture, I was looking at a famous study showing the foods that they were eating, and they had 94% of their calories coming from either beans, whole grains, or sweet potatoes. 94%. Those are the longest lived people, very low diabetes rates, low chronic disease rates, and you'll see this in all these other areas highlighted on the map. We don't have time to go into it today, but if you want to learn more, check out the Blue Zones book and also a great book called Healthy at 100 by John Robbins. So let's wrap this up here. How to maximize insulin sensitivity, how to reverse insulin resistance. Those two are basically the exact same thing. How to reverse type 2 diabetes. Again, this is all the same thing because type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance. When you reverse insulin resistance, as we saw over and over and over again in the peer-reviewed research, you can reverse type 2 diabetes. This is done through a low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet. It's that simple. Right now we have the 2019 Mastering Diabetes Online Summit going on. I have to tell you guys about that. It's free. You just go to masteringdiabetes.org, click Summit, and you can register. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to 32 of the world's leading experts, physicians, researchers who've been doing this for decades in our modern day environment. Look at the results they're getting. It's really fun to see people consistently saying the same thing over and over again. This is a picture of me and Cyrus. We're the co-founders of Mastering Diabetes, and you have our website URL there. We are publishing articles and recipes, and we have coaching, we have the summit, we have retreats. We're doing everything we can to share this information with the world because we are a minority right now. We're really David versus Goliath in this situation of people talking about diabetes health and emphasizing carbohydrate-rich foods. I mean, it truly, truly is that simple. There are a lot of other factors. There's a lot of ways to improve your health, make this even more effective. So we're talking about exercise, intermittent fasting. We have Amla Green, which I think we have a giveaway tonight. So the Mastering Diabetes method includes a lot more than just the diet. But in today's presentation, I just wanted to share the scientific evidence supporting the dietary component of what we teach. I told you the conclusion in the beginning, a minimum of 70% of calories coming from whole carbohydrate-rich foods. Then you want a maximum of 15% coming from protein and a maximum of 15% coming from fat. So that's it.